Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture. We are now getting into the second half of Unit 1, so we will be focusing now on the Age of Exploration. The section for today's lecture is 1.6, Technological Advances and the Age of Exploration. Your objectives for today's lecture are to first explain the technological factors that facilitated European exploration and expansion from 1450 to 1648, and also to explain the motivations for and the effects of European exploration and expansion from 1450 to 1648. Now, that second objective is a big one, and we will continue to add to that throughout the entire rest of the unit. So if you feel a little intimidated by in answering that objective right now, don't worry. Do the best that you can after today's lecture, and of course, keep in mind we're going to continue to learn about the effects of European exploration and the motivations for it as well. And the primary theme for today's lecture, not surprisingly, should be technology, technological and scientific innovation, although we are also going to start to see the theme of interactions play, of course, a very important role throughout the rest of this unit. So let's look at some of the key causes of European expansion. Generally, we can summarize these causes as God, gold, and glory. However, technology is another important cause of European expansion in the early modern era, specifically developments in navigation, cartography, which is map making, and military technology. Most notably, there was new technology for ships imported from China, things like the axial rudder, which provided for improved change of directions. It was kind of like a steering wheel for a ship. Also, lateen sails. Lateen sails were a triangular sail that allowed boats to move against the wind, and they were used on a new type of ship called the caravel. And the caravel was a lighter, faster ship, better suited for exploration of coastal areas. And it was used by the Portuguese to explore the African coast when they began their explorations in that region. There's also important navigational technology that is developed and makes its way to Europe, such as the compass and the astrolabe. These also came from trade with China. The compass arrived in Europe around the 14th century, and you may know what a compass is, but here's an image of one on the screen. It basically always points to the magnetic north, which makes it easier to navigate. And then an astrolabe is another type of contraption, piece of technology, I should say. And an astrolabe basically determines someone's latitude by measuring the altitude of the stars of various celestial bodies and constellations. So that's how you can determine your latitude while navigating. There's also important improvements in cartography, which is map making. For example, in 1492, Martin Behaim made the first terrestrial globe, the first round globe like you see here. And then in 1507, this is Waldseeler's world map. So one of the first world maps to recognize the Americas. But you can see on the far left, the Americas are much thinner than we know them to be now. This is because by 1507, there was only a preliminary understanding of the size and the shape of that continent. And then by 1575, we start to see the development of the Mercator's map. And the Mercator's map now has a better development of the Americas and a better understanding of the coastlines of also the Eastern Hemisphere as well. The development of printing also helped the spread of accurate maps. And of course, as there are more and more voyages of discovery, more and more geographic knowledge is gathered to support additional map making. Military technology was also very important, specifically the development of gunpowder and cannons in the late Middle Ages. Gunpowder was originally developed in China and made its way towards Europe, where it became more weaponized. And gunpowder and cannons provided protection against hostile ships. So ships like the caravel could also be outfitted with cannons to protect themselves and protect their economic interests. And in addition, this provided, or allowed, I should say, Europeans to have military domination over most indigenous peoples who did not yet have access to gunpowder and cannons. So overall, all this technology enabled Europeans to establish overseas colonies and empires. And the first countries that began exploring, Portugal and Spain, often treated this new technology like state secrets that needed to be protected because they didn't want England or France to use this technology and compete with them for territory in the New World and new trade routes. Beyond technology, we really can narrow down these motivations and causes to the phrase God, gold, and glory. This, of course, is a very simplified idea, but if we unpack each of those, we can see that there are some very valid motivations and causes for European expansion. Let's start first with gold. So that's economic motivations and changes. One of the early developments in European trade had been the growth of something called the Hanseatic League, which helped facilitate the revival of long-distance trade during the Middle Ages. So the Hanseatic League was a federation of sort of northern European towns, kind of along the Dutch and German coast in sort of north and western Europe. And this had developed during the Middle Ages, during the high and late Middle Ages. It traded a lot, of course, with the Italian city-states, but it also allowed for the routes of commercial expansion in northwestern Europe. Also, Christian crusaders in the 11th and 14th centuries had created considerable European interest in Asia and the Middle East, and new types of both luxury and popular goods, which became coveted across Europe. Also, by the early modern period, we are starting to see population recovery from the Black Death. Population had started to recover during the 15th century and into the 16th century. So, for example, by the year 1500, which was the beginning of the 16th century, there were about 70 million people in Europe. And 100 years later, in the year 1600, there were about 90 million people in Europe. Therefore, more consumers meant a greater demand for goods. And we will learn more about how the population growth would affect prices and the expansion of commerce when we get to section 1.10, the Commercial Revolution. And another really important economic change was the fall of Constantinople, which, as we've mentioned, is a major turning point in Western civilization. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was when the Byzantine Empire lost control of their city, Constantinople, and ultimately their empire. It fell to the Ottoman Turks. And with the fall of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire also came the loss of access to trade in the Eastern Mediterranean, because now the Ottomans had a complete monopoly on trade, or they cut off trade routes entirely, especially trade routes like the Silk Road, which came all across the Asian continent, and trade associated with the Black Sea region. And so while the fall of Constantinople was great for the Ottomans, they accessed all this lucrative trade in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea region, it was actually very damaging to European trade. The Ottoman conquest negatively affected the highly lucrative trade routes of the Italian city-states. So in some ways, the fall of Constantinople is also the beginning of the end of the dominance of the Italian city-states. They're still going to squeeze out a few more decades, but this is a major factor in their economic success and longevity. Again, because their trade routes to the Eastern Mediterranean are either blocked off or totally monopolized by the Ottomans. Now, this meant that many Europeans the Italians, but really more the Portuguese and the Spanish, are looking for new trade routes. All right. What they are really looking for is an alternate route to Asia more than anything. Now that Constantinople has fallen and the Ottoman Turks control the Eastern Mediterranean, Europeans are trying to find that alternate route to Asia so they can directly access some of these luxury goods in India, in Indonesia, in China, for example, because also with that population growth, there was increased demand for luxury and popular goods. And if the Europeans could find a way to circumvent the Turks and other Arab middlemen and access the goods directly from the source, like in India and China, then they would make a much greater profit, a much greater profit. So remember, the key motivating factor, especially the economic factor, is to find that alternate route to Asia. So secondary to the economic motivation is the motivation for either personal wealth or state power, kind of a political motivation. And the age of exploration coincides in a lot of ways with the rise of new monarchs and nation states. As these new monarchs and nation states created competition with each other over empire and trade, especially Portuguese and Spanish merchants wanted to break the Italian monopoly on trade with Asia. So like I said, the age of exploration is going to support the rise of places like Spain and eventually France and England and even Portugal and the Netherlands, and it's going to be very damaging to the Italian city-states. Also, nation states like Spain and France and England had a larger tax base and more economic stability, which allowed them to raise the massive amounts of capital, meaning stuff, people, ships, technology, all of that. It allowed them to raise the massive amounts of capital that were necessary for the voyages of exploration. This is one of the reasons that the Italian city-states were not sponsoring the voyages of exploration, is because they frankly didn't have the resources for them. And another sort of more social motivation for the age of exploration is something we call primogeniture. So primogeniture was a social tradition going back centuries, really, into the Middle Ages. And primogeniture means that there's a limited economic opportunity for younger sons. Okay, so in the practice of primogeniture basically means the oldest son in the family gets everything. All right, they get the titles, they get the land, they get the money, or as much of any of that is available. And so this created a lot of limitations for younger sons. Younger sons may have the option of going into the clergy or the military, but ultimately there were a lot of young men who had no economic opportunity, and so exploration became an attractive option for these young men who were seeking fame and fortune. And then the last motivating factor I want to discuss today is religious zeal. And you can think of that as just like religious enthusiasm. Again, this is part of that God, gold, and glory motivation. Now, this was particularly true for the Portuguese and the Spanish, all right, these Catholic countries. And remember all that energy that they had put into the Reconquista in reconquering the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims. Well, that same fervor, that same enthusiasm and energy carries over into their conquest and exploration of the New World. So even though economic motivation is definitely the primary motivating factor, this I think was actually probably secondary to especially the Portuguese and the Spanish, because they did have a desire to spread Christianity. And when they encountered indigenous peoples who were pagan, meaning not Christian, they felt the need to convert those indigenous peoples to become Christian. And one of the other things that's important to remember here is that in this time period, in the 15th and 16th centuries, spiritual and secular affairs were closely intertwined. And so the Portuguese and the Spanish in particular did not really have much separation of church and state. And remember, of course, we know about that sort of religious culture established in Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella. All right, that brings us to the end of our 1.6 lecture. This was nice and short. Please do not forget to do your wrap-up and your write-up, I should say. And please tune in for 1.7, which will be a little bit longer. Thank you for listening.